It automatically starts at 10 if you want to go ahead.
Hello. Hello, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this online webinar and event that we organized today with the Responsible Business Conduct Working Group of the European Parliament. Fern is very delighted to welcome all of you. We have a very high number of registration. We have recorded 277 people who would attend this event, which is about ending imported destruction and the big question how the EU can regulate to protect forests and people. So as we know, forests are at risk around the globe. And we see that today already in the Amazon, the forest fires are starting. A very hot summer in Europe is announced, and so the forests are at risk. Luckily, there is a growing understanding that something needs to be done, and that we also need to make sure that our supply chains are deforestation free. So a lot of action has been undertaken, including from the EU, and we see that a lot of activities and actions are undertaken. So today we welcome you to this important event that comes really timely. And well, I'm very happy to introduce you to Heidi Hautala, the Vice President of the Responsible, well, of the European Parliament, and also chairing the Responsible Business Conduct Working Group. We also have a facilitator for you, Bernd Lange, who is the chairperson of the Trade Committee at the European Parliament, and also some people from the European Commission are with us, as well as representatives from the private sector and the OECD. So before we start, I would really like to rush or run through the house rules today with you. My colleague, my colleague Daria will put up, I think, a slide for you, which unfortunately I cannot see. But so the idea is that the panelists switch on their microphones and that the participants are muted. We do have 3 sessions in this webinar. And one is where we will speak with the European Union. It will be facilitated by Heidi. Then we will go over to the private sector, which will be facilitated by Bernd Lange. And then we will give the floor to the OECD, again facilitated by Heidi. And so for each session, we will invite you to have some, raise some clarification questions. And at the end, we will have a discussion. For the clarification questions, we will ask you not to put on your cameras, but then later on for the discussion, we will switch over to you, and so you can present yourself and present your questions. So we would like also to send us your questions through the chat box, which will arrive to the panelists, and so Fern will help out to make a selection of the questions. So I'm pleased to go over to Heidi now to further introduce the discussion. Please, Heidi.
Yeah, thank you so much, Indra. This is again a wonderful example of cooperation between the civil society, lawmakers, European Commission, and many more interested stakeholders. And I'm very happy to see that we have reached a point where we can seriously discuss how the EU, as the world's biggest internal market and a real sort of rule maker, in my conviction, can stop deforestation. Of course, it's a very multifaceted phenomenon, but most likely since the Amazon fires last summer, people have become much more aware of imported deforestation, which immediately puts the limelight on supply chains. And I believe that we have been aware for quite some time that the European Commission has been working on different strategies on how to combat deforestation. There was a milestone when the civil society and some key MEPs more or less compelled the European Commission to publish a feasibility study that they have made, which showed very clearly that the mandatory due diligence approach would be the most effective one to address imported deforestation and deforestation in general. Another milestone was when the Commission last year published the action plan on deforestation and forest degradation, where we already saw hints at some regulatory measures. Now, meanwhile, we have had a very extensive discussion on mandatory due diligence as a horizontal legislation applying to all enterprises in all sectors operating in the European internal market. And by the side of that, there is now an emerging awareness that we need to have also maybe product-based instruments which address the deforestation and other challenges such as child labor in supply chains of what we now generally call forest and ecosystem risk products, so commodities. And I would say yesterday was also an important day when it became very clear that DG Envy and Commissioner Tsinkevicius has plans to respond with a regulatory instrument. And this has a lot to do with the draft report that we have now since a couple of weeks drafted by Delara Burkhardt for the Environment Committee. And there will be opinions coming from other committees. So there we can really discuss what the regulatory instruments to tackle deforestation should be. And I'm more and more convinced that we can have a mandatory human rights and environment due diligence legislation by the side of a product-based instrument, which is more, let's say, designed according to the lessons we have from BPA FLECT, which addresses illegal timber. We can stretch that concept to other forest risk commodities such as cocoa, soy, palm, maybe beef, just to name a few. So now is a very active time for cooperation and really common creation of ideas for what the European Union should do, and it is already doing. So it's not anymore just words and demands. There are things happening. And I'll close by saying that one of the most promising things is that I also see very much now that the European Commission directorates general are much more working together on this type of issues, and particularly these issues now than ever before. And because these issues are cross-cutting, they stretch from environment to trade, and everything between, company law. So this is very necessary. And that's exactly what we are trying to do in the European Parliament as well in our Responsible Business Conduct Working Group. It will be a most exciting time now that several parliamentary committees are drafting reports, and the rapporteurs and the so-called shadow rapporteurs can work closely together to put together something very consistent, also very much in consultation with all the stakeholders, from civil society to progressive business, and in interaction with the European Commission. So I believe that this discussion today could put a lot of clarity to our understanding of what the regulatory measures should be. So with these words, let me invite Sofia Keretchen from DG Just, working on EU corporate governance, to discuss the initiatives that her DG is working on. And it's really a pleasure to see you here, Sofia. So can I hand over to you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. Well, Heidi presented already to some extent the initiative that I would like to be speaking about. So indeed, Commissioner Reinders announced already in this very working group that we will prepare an initiative that should be adopted early 2021 on sustainable corporate governance. And this initiative, the need for this initiative was already referred to in the Green Deal communication, and it's also something that has been included in many of the implementing strategies of the Green Deal communication. So this is an initiative that would be central to deliver on the sustainability transition on the sustainable recovery. Now, we are today finalizing a very important preparatory work that led to basically us now understanding what exactly we would like to be tackled in this initiative. 2 studies have been launched. One has already been presented, a due diligence study in this very working group. And another one will soon be presented also, and will also be published soon on board duty. So now I go more concretely into what concrete problems we would like to address in this initiative. So indeed, this would be a corporate governance initiative. One of the most important problems that we have identified that is a big barrier to the sustainability transition is a very strong focus of companies on short-term financial performance. So we have been seeing, and we have been dealing with this for a long time, we have been seeing that companies focus a lot, especially listed companies focus a lot on quarterly results, pushing up the share price. But what we have also we have new evidence gathered is that companies have basically, in the last 30 years, companies have become or have increasingly been paying out their income to shareholders. So while the share of dividends and share buybacks compared to the net income of the companies have been 20% 30 years ago, now it's 60%. So companies are increasingly paying out, and this to the detriment of long-term investment into the long-term interest of the company, into sustainable business models, into new facilities, into research and development. All these investment levels compared to revenue and net income are going down. So this is a clear obstacle to the transition. Companies need longer term time horizons to integrate sustainability risk, sustainability impacts into business operations. So this is one of the problems that we would like to address. The second problem is the unregulated supply chains. Everybody knows that most of the harm is in the supply chain. Supply chains are largely unregulated today. Our due diligence study shows that only 1 in 3 companies basically even say that they have due diligence processes in place. So NGO reports actually show that even lower number of companies have really due diligence processes. So if only 1 in 3 have, it shows that voluntary approaches so far have not been working, have not been able to generate the change that we need. So what are the issues that we will be focusing in this initiative? Again, to respond to these 2 big challenges, first issue would be the clarification of directors' duties. This to basically fight the short-term focus on maximizing short-term financial value and redistributing the value to shareholders. We aim to clarify in directors' duties that alongside the interest of the shareholders, they also need to properly balance the interest of other stakeholders, and these other stakeholders also include the environment, and that would be the local and global environment. So this aspect is also very important in our view from a deforestation perspective. Now, we are also considering introducing other duties like duties for the companies to integrate sustainability risk and impacts into the corporate strategy and also adopt science-based targets. And the other big area would be the due diligence. So there, our thinking today, and Heidi also mentioned, is to impose a horizontal due diligence obligation, which would be cross-thematic in a sense that we would like companies to identify all human rights, social and environmental possible negative environmental impacts in their own operations and in their supply chains. A cross-sectorial initiative, and our intention is that this should basically apply to the production process. So the company should look into these possible impacts and mitigate these impacts in the whole production process. So starting from raw material sourcing to production, transport, and so on. Now, as you also said, this would be an initiative which is based on do no harm. So the focus would be on the harm. And we would like to cover environmental harm as well, alongside human rights harm. This is an evolution that we see already in due diligence frameworks. They started by focusing on human rights, but then they kind of evolved towards focus also on environmental matters. So we would like to also propose something that tackles human rights, social and environmental risks. Now we have looked into existing private sector standards, social and environmental standards. And what is interesting is that on human rights, they all converge because it's kind of easy to say what is the requirement, what companies should do, what is the expected performance that they should demonstrate. On environment, interestingly, the standards also converge on quite a number of issues. And for example, deforestation is one, zero deforestation ambition, or on biodiversity, net zero biodiversity loss, or climate change, CO2 emission reduction, and so on. So we already see also a convergence in the performance requirements in the private sector initiatives. Obviously, the challenge here is also to link with Europe's big ambitions, and also with those ambitions that are where the scientific communities agree that this is what should be done. So, for example, climate neutrality by 2050, or the net zero biodiversity loss ambition. So the challenge is also to translate these science-based targets into this process. So another thing maybe very important to mention is the Commissioner was also very clear on this in his presentation, that we would like to set a system where there would be a strong enforcement mechanism as well. So he was also speaking about a civil liability mechanism and strong enforcement through administrative supervision, and there could also be a cooperation between the supervisory authorities at EU level. So I would like to stop here, and I'm very happy to and maybe also just to mention that of course we see this initiative as being complementary to a more possibly products-based initiative on deforestation. What we see is that the focus on production process in general, and on all companies, and on the harm is very important also, because deforestation is not happening only through importing commodities. There are many sectors that contribute also to deforestation, mining, infrastructure, and so on. So we also need a horizontal instrument, but this can also be complemented by a more product-specific instrument. Of course, the two need to be coherent and be aligned, but this is how we see the relationship also of the two instruments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sofia. It's hard to believe that we are where we are now. We still have a lot, even the hardest work is still ahead of us, and the struggles against those who want to stay free riders, but I'm sure that together we will make it. So it will be very exciting now, after Sofia's view from DG Justice, to hear from DG Environment from Bojan Ras. about the regulatory measures, in particular relating to due diligence to avoid placing deforestation products on the EU market. So thanks, Bojan. Take the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I am Bojan Grlaš. I'm the team leader of the International Forestry team in DG Environment, working on deforestation and many other related issues, including fighting illegal logging. It is great to see you all today and see that there is such a big interest in this subject, and also in general that there seems to be quite a strong push, not only within the Commission, where the next steps on this in this context are clear, but also in the European Parliament, in the civil society, and among many other stakeholders. So this seems to be the right time to build together the best tools to fight deforestation from the EU and globally. I would like to, before I start presenting briefly on our current work in DG Environment, I would like to emphasize that there seems to have been a small mistake in the agenda for my point, because it says regulatory measures, including a due diligence regulation to avoid placing deforestation-free products on the EU market. As you see, it's a little bit written in a different way, but the important issue there is that you will hear from my presentation that the legislative proposal that we will be presenting in the first quarter of next year, as already included in the Commission work program, and as our Commissioner mentioned yesterday, will not necessarily be based only on due diligence, but I will now try to explain more. So just as Sophie said, the initiative in DG Environment focusing on minimizing the risk of products being associated with deforestation and forest degradation at the EU market comes from the European Green Deal, and then it was clearly confirmed also in the biodiversity strategy, but also farm to fork strategy. That builds on the communication that was adopted last year, where we have a number of other measures identified beyond this regulatory approach, and we are working on many of those. In terms of currently where we stand, we are already undertaking the impact assessment, and we will be very soon launching, very probably next month, the open public consultation, and then following the next steps until the results that are expected in the first quarter of 2021. As I mentioned, we will be looking at a very broad range of possible tools to be used in the new regulation. Due diligence is one of them, but there are also others, such as potential of mandatory labeling, but also particularly interesting some elements of the IUU fishing experience that might actually be very useful in combination of those that we learn from the EU timber regulation, for example, to make that work better, and a number of things related with green finances and other elements. So just to keep in mind that what we are trying to do there is a broad exercise following the Commission better regulation principles and assessing all possible options or a combination between different elements of these. That is important because we have had the 7 years of experience in EU timber regulation implementation based on due diligence. And in parallel to the impact assessment, we are actually undertaking the fitness check of EU timber regulation and FLEGT regulation. The lessons from the experience, long experience in implementation of these two regulations will be crucial, but not the only input for the impact assessment. They will be crucial, for example, in terms of EU timber regulation, because we know that there are some challenges, and also we know that other stakeholders are well aware. We have witnessed quite some criticism and motivation from the civil society in order to make things work better. Sometimes it's about enforcement, but other times it's actually about the regulation itself. And other times it's about the concept of the due diligence focusing on products that we have there, which we have seen in a number of member states, especially those that whose legal system is not based on the Anglo-Saxon law, that there are some serious challenges when this comes to court. And you can actually see this only after 3, 4, 5 years of implementation, when there are actual cases on courts, And if that doesn't work, or if you don't have the tools to make it work, then the whole system can be jeopardized. So we strongly believe that we need to learn from that experience, use the good elements, and avoid making the same mistakes in the new regulation, which will necessarily be much more complex, because on the one hand, you have the jump from legality to sustainability, and on the other hand, you have the jump from wood to many other commodities. So the complexity grows exponentially. I would like to add to this that it's excellent to see that there are a number of initiatives in the European Parliament. Of course, the own legislative initiative will be taken into account in the Commission work. We are very much looking forward to learn more about the deliberations in the Parliament in the next period, and looking forward to the conclusions or news after the summer. We also, I also wish to point out that we cooperate very closely with the colleagues across the Commission, not only DG Just, but that is an extremely interesting cooperation, because, as Sophie said, the two initiatives are complementary, and they can actually be supportive one to each other in very, very interesting and nice ways. One focusing on business operations, and the other focusing on products. One being on more general level, the other one very specific in the complex, not so small area of deforestation related issues. We also cooperate clearly with a number of others, including DG DevCo, Agri, and Trade, and many others. I think I will stop now, and thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bojan. I think it was also great to hear your assessment of the existing product-based instruments, that if we are going to extend their scope in several ways, then the complexity also increases exponentially, as you said. So this is already promising, and now I would like to invite Delara Burkhardt, the rapporteur on the legislative own initiative report on EU legal framework to halt and reverse EU-driven global deforestation, to take the floor. So Delara, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Heidi, and thank you, everyone. I'm really looking forward to the discussion having with you today, and I really have to say that I share also Heidi's enthusiasm, because I think it's really amazing to see how in the Parliament, cross-committee-wise, we are pushing together. And the first proof was the last debate, I think last week, when we were talking about the situation in the Amazon, where we saw a lot of commitment in the Parliament to tackle, also of course in the Commission. So I wanted to concentrate my remarks on the draft report, because I think it's interesting for the round we are having here, and because the event comes very timely for that. Just last week I published my draft report for if the full title, an EU legal framework to halt and reverse EU-driven global deforestation. And the first analysis I would take in this proposal is that I think it's very clear, and this is also what a lot of industries that are organizing and mobilizing to have a regulation on deforestation risk commodities, is one conclusion, that voluntary commitments by companies have failed. And also we see that labels alone, I believe, cannot be the solution, as I don't think it's right to push the responsibility to choose deforestation free commodities that shall be shifted to the consumers. I see companies as having the responsibility to make deforestation-free products to be the norm in the EU. That's why the key feature of my proposal will be mandatory due diligence. I propose that all companies placing certain products, for instance, soy, palm oil, meat, I saw rubber in the chat, cocoa, coffee, have to make sure that in every step of the entire value chain that these products did not contribute to the destruction or degradation of forests and important ecosystems, or the violation of human rights, because I think it's important that we see sustainability also being as a broad scope. With the report, I am proposing 4 duties for companies. The first one would be the duty of due diligence. Companies have to assess the risk of the practices on forests, ecosystems, and people in all steps of the value chain, and take action where they see, identify risks, and to mitigate or prevent them. They shall prove that their products do not come from land that until 2008 could be identified as natural forest land and was converted for other land use afterwards. The same should be relevant for ecosystems other than forests that are particularly important for biodiversity and climate protection, because we see that if we only concentrate on forest, the tension might get higher on other ecosystems. Also, companies shall prove that their products are not linked to the degradation of forests or ecosystems. And thirdly, they shall prove that their products are not linked to human rights violations, in particular violations of land use and land ownership rights and the right of informed consent. The second duty I will introduce with this report is the duty of consultation. So companies shall consult with stakeholders, NGOs, trade unions, affected communities, scientists, etc. about the design of the due diligence systems and their risk assessments. Companies should install a kind of early warning mechanism where stakeholders can warn them about potential and actual risks. I think this is very important as they are experts on the ground and can help to prevent harm before it happens. The third duty introduced in the report is the duty of transparency and reporting. Companies shall regularly and publicly report about their risk assessment, activities and outcomes. This allows, of course, also third parties to scrutinize their activities. And the fourth duty I'm proposing in the report is that companies shall keep record of all the activities and make them available upon request by national authorities to investigate potential failures to comply with the regulation. But I also think that next to the duties, another key feature should be the question of liability, because I think a regulation without liability will be a toothless declaration of intent. I believe that companies shall be criminally and civilly liable for breaches of the regulations obligations, for causing harm to individuals and organizations by breaching the regulations obligations. And that's why I think it's important that member states shall provide for proportionate penalties and sanctions for non-compliance, and companies shall provide for remedy to harmed individuals to the regulation. For that purpose, I also think it's important, especially as when we think about examples of indigenous people, that third parties shall be able to challenge non-compliance of companies with the regulations obligations before judicial and administrative authorities. So a question that I was asked a lot lately, how would this proposal actually interact with the general corporate due diligence regulation? And I believe we need a general corporate due diligence regulation, but I don't think that a general regulation and a product-specific regulation would be mutually exclusive. Rather, I think they would be complementing to each other, because I believe that commodities associated to particularly high risk for people and nature, like forest risk commodities, but also, for example, taking the example of textiles, would profit from more specialized provisions that are embedded in a general framework for corporate due diligence. So we can provide a clearer definition of what deforestation is, or adapt the scope of which companies should be covered by the specific regulation given the special context of the commodities at hand. Also, I think it's important to push on a deforestation specific concept, because I think the public visibility of the question of deforestation is very much high in the awareness at the moment, and there's a momentum to go ahead with the regulation to stop deforestation. So I hope we also can push the discussion on a general corporate due diligence regulation with that discussion, with the report I was drafting last week, and build on this momentum. But I also share the enthusiasm in this room with all the civil actors, industry actors, Parliament Commission pushing for action, and my report was one of the proposals we can maybe start the discussion with.
Thanks so much, Dilara. And now we have a little bit time for a couple of questions, maybe 10 minutes. And I think Indra and others have collected a couple of questions for me to announce. They should appear in the chat, I was told, but I don't see. Yes, There is a question from Juan Castro. Good morning. What do you think about the Mercosur trade? Is it coherent with Green Deal and biodiversity European biodiversity strategy? Thanks. Well, this is a very political question, and I'm sure that it could be discussed in the further parts as well. But does anyone want to take the floor of the speakers that we've had so far? Sophie, Bojan, Delara. Delara, do you want to start?
Yes, maybe I think it's also important to discuss what I heard so far. And we know that if we want to due diligence to be effective, that we need kind of partnerships with the countries. But I think that especially when it comes to Mercosur, we see that there's the defined will of some political actors not to comply with rules we are setting when it comes to deforestation. And I think that for this discussion on future trade agreements, like Mercosur, we have to make sure that there's legally binding chapters of sustainability in it. And I don't see the progress on that on Mercosur, but of course there are also colleagues from the Intercommittee who might also have a more depth insights in the discussions we are having right now. But on the situation now, I don't see a legal implementation of sustainable criteria in the agreement, and thus I don't think it will be beneficial for the goal we are setting when it comes to step up against global deforestation.
Thanks, Delara. I could maybe, let's say, turn this question a little bit to our other speakers, because what I even yesterday I asked the DG Trade Director General Sabine Vajand about how they are involved, and I got the confirmation that we know since some time that DG Trade is also very involved in the discussion on how to incorporate due diligence to free trade agreements. So, and that was always my view, that with a strong due diligence legislation, we could also enhance the sustainability of our trade agreements. The question is how to do that, how to make those obligations really enforceable, which they are not at the moment. But I don't know if Sofia or Bojan could maybe shed a little bit light on the sort of inter-service discussions on this, because it's a great step that DG Trade is also now involved in these discussions. Anyone?
Yes, thank you very much. If I may, yeah, it's very good to see. I think that the question was let's say the interrelation between the agreement and also the European Green Deal and other relevant strategies. It's very good to see that there are a lot of discussions on how to make the best use and how to ensure that actually, of course, that also the agreement and everything else the Commission does complies with and goes in the same direction that is announced in all the strategies of the Commission and at the EU level. Just to say that from the general point of view, we know that at the moment what is there in the trade agreements is the trade and sustainability chapter, but there are also other elements. And this does open a communication channel with third countries, which can certainly be useful also in terms of deforestation. I don't, as I said, there are ongoing discussions, so there are open views on possibly building on the experience until now and then developing further. Thank you very much.
Sophie, would you want to add something to this? Sophie, do you want to answer, or shall I turn to some other people to ask questions?
Sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, thank you very much. So indeed, so you asked generally more about the cooperation with DG Trade. So indeed, DG Trade has always been involved in the discussions on responsible business conduct topics. So we have a cooperation in the Commission on this. Now, there was a lot of focus now so far in the discussions also on the due diligence duty, while we developed, when we conducted the study, while we developed the concept, and there was this growing agreement now within the Commission that this is absolutely needed and this is absolutely crucial. Now, of course, we don't have this duty yet, so we cannot incorporate a possible duty in a trade agreement. So what we can do at this stage definitely is to start working on strengthening the trade agreements and the sustainability chapters, because that will also help us in moving forward with the due diligence, because this will help us ensuring level playing field, also not only help us to make real due diligence reality also in third countries, but help us also in the acceptance of this, that this needs to be done. We have to deliver on this, but we also have to help our companies and to provide for more level playing field. So I definitely think that we have an interest, and this is a very important topic. But the concrete discussion has not started. At least we have not been involved yet on how exactly to do this.
Thanks very much, Sophia. I think this is very promising. We have to support this development. Now, there is one clarification question from Duncan Brack, and that will be the last one. So, Duncan, maybe you want to present it yourself. I don't pick it up from the chat then. Duncan?
Yeah, sure. It's I'm just picking up on something that Bojan said. You know, I think, Bojan, you said that the legislative proposal that you'll be bringing forward next year would not only include due diligence. So does that mean it will definitely include due diligence, but there might be other things as well? Or is it just one of a range of options that are being considered?
Bojan?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Duncan, for your question. Nice to see you in the middle of a tropical forest there. No, to answer your question, actually, it's a very good question. Following the better regulation rules and the rules that the Commission has in terms of how to organize impact assessments, we have to look at all options, and all options are open. So basically, that means that we will, as I mentioned, be looking at the long list of possible options, their combinations, but nothing is preconceived. So we are not in a position. It would be unacceptable, also under the Commission rules, to already now say yes, one of these will be included in one way or another. That will be known later in the process, and once we have the results of the assessment undertaken by the better regulation rules. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And now we are exactly on time, and I would like to hand over to Ben. Ben, would you want to announce that you will be the rapporteur of the due diligence opinion of your committee?
Heidi, thanks a lot. And of course, you announce a secret. No, it's not a secret. Indeed, I am the rapporteur for the International Trade Committee on the binding legislation for due diligence. And I'm really keen to give really pressure to that, because I'm convinced that regarding supply chains worldwide, we need binding due diligence in the supply chain. By the way, of course, I was a little provoked during the discussion with DG Trade, and of course, we are really focusing on an improvement of the TSD chapter. So I myself presented an enforceable proposal for a TSD chapter, and hopefully we'll have a proper discussion with the Commissioner on further development of an TSD chapter. I'm sure that their position at the moment is not the end of the day. Nevertheless, now we are discussing the situation of the private sector in the deforestation context. And of course, we have companies trying to be sustainable, and of course we have some free riders. And my question would be really, what is the situation between these two different behavior of companies? And secondly, what is the feeling about binding regulation, which we are discussing here on the European level now? And of course, I would also like to raise the question, what is the question of our consumption regarding the export of these goods which are harming the Amazon region. So is there a link between our consumption and the deforestation and how companies could react on that? So first intervention we will have from Felipe Caruso, the head of public sector engagement at the Tropical Forest Alliance. Please, Felipe.
Thank you, Bernd. On behalf of the Tropical Forest Alliance, TFA, I would like to thank the Responsible Business Conduct Working Group and FERN for the invitation to this event. TFA is a catalytic platform that provides an inclusive and trusted space for dialogue, enabling the private sector to engage and take action to reduce commodity-driven deforestation in collaboration with governments, civil society, and other stakeholders. TFA has over 160 partners, many of them companies, and has established action platforms in key demand and producer countries. We have some slides, and I don't know if they're being projected, but I will continue. We have been implementing a series of roundtables to capture and develop collective views from the private sector, very much on line of what you're mentioning, Bert. How do we understand better what's the trade-off that companies will be subject to? And as well, in those discussions, we have included other key TFA partner organizations, trying to have an open discussion about what this means. Both representatives across Europe and across different commodity supply chains, because of the horizontal and vertical perspective that we've heard about. Those roundtables have gone around the 5 priorities that are outlined by the July 2019 European Commission communication, as you can see in the graph that has been projected. Input and reflections from these convenings will lead to the creation of discussion papers, which will convey perspectives and trends about the level of ambition and challenges faced by industry on this matter. We do hope that these discussion papers are a useful input to support development of an ambitious and pragmatic EU policy action framework that can help protect and restore the world's forests, our main objective, common objective, and that can bridge consumers with producers, private sector with public sector, north with south, into a collective effort for a green, resilient, just, and prosperous recovery for sustainable food systems while providing livelihoods for millions. I want to give the floor to my colleague Duncan Brack from our partner organization, EFECA. Duncan will share key elements of what we have captured along these roundtables, especially when discussing due diligence, which is of importance for today's conversation. And as well, provide a reflection around why we advocate for a smart mix of measures in trying to move forward a balanced approach. Thank you very much, Bern, and I'll leave it to Duncan to go into details.
Thanks very much, Felipe. Could we have the presentation back, and I will carry on. Yeah, my name's Duncan Brack. I'm actually a freelance researcher. As many of you probably know, I've worked on projects for the European Commission, for member state governments, for NGOs, and on this occasion for EFECA, the UK-based consultancy, which is working with the Tropical Forest Alliance to conduct this series of roundtable discussions on aspects of the deforestation communication. And I'm actually speaking from London, not from the middle of a rainforest, though it is almost as hot and humid as at the moment in London as it might be there. Now, just picking up what Felipe said, we've had 10 roundtables in total, or the last one is still to come, and you can see the list of them there. As you see, due diligence, which we're focusing on this morning, was one of the key issues. In fact, probably the one we discussed more than anything else. And it came up in both the first wave, and we had a more detailed look in the second wave. If we could have the next point, please. On the slide, we had almost 150 organizations involved, mostly private sector, though we also had observers from the European Commission and quite a good range from civil society as well. And next point, please. And the commodities represented were mostly companies dealing with palm oil, soy, and cocoa, but we also had quite a good range. We had ones dealing in coffee, rubber, and timber, pulp, and paper as well. Next point, thank you. Now, the purpose of the roundtable series is not to reach an agreed position. I think that would be probably impossible given the range of companies and other organizations we're talking about. But what we're going to try and do in the discussion papers is summarize the main views that were put forward during the roundtables. And I think it's true to say, I mean, people will have the chance, participants will have the chance to reflect back on what we put in the draft papers, and that process is still underway. But I think it's true to say that discussions actually showed a very wide range of wide consensus, and actually on almost everything we talked about, and in particular a very broad support for EU-wide mandatory due diligence legislation. And we have just the last point on this slide. Separately from our roundtable series, we've seen a number of position papers published by industries and industry trade associations in recent months in response to the European Commission's work that have called explicitly for mandatory due diligence. And you saw the Cocoa Coalition paper, which was originally Barry Callebaut, Mars and Mondelez, together with the Voice Network of NGOs, Fairtrade and Rainforest Alliance. Published in December, that's now been joined by Nestlé's Tony's Chocolonely and Unilever, Cabisco, the Confectionery Manufacturers Alliance, European Cocoa Association, European Palm Oil Alliance, Food Drink Europe, French Alliance for the Preservation of Forests, and then most recently a joint statement by 3 trade associations dealing with vegetable oil, grains, cereals, and feed. So you're seeing, I think, quite a broad range of support now for mandatory due diligence legislation. So let's unpick that in a bit more detail. And if we go on to the next slide. And this is, as I said, this is kind of our summary so far of what the roundtables came up with. Participants will have the chance to feedback on this, but I think this is a reasonable summary. And we've separated this into one slide dealing with the general aims of what the due diligence legislation should aim to achieve, and then I'll go on to a bit more detail in the next slide. So what our participants thought the point of due diligence legislation was as follows: to transform global commodity supply chains. Obviously, we can try our best to clean up European supply chains, but really we want to do more than that. We want to address the root causes of deforestation and unsustainable behavior. Due diligence, we think, is a good tool to enhance traceability and encourage a better understanding of supply chains and their exposure to risk. There's a kind of separate discussion about what the risk issues are. Should there be illegality, unsustainability, deforestation, human rights abuses? We didn't come down to a sort of a conclusion on that, but it's a fair, all those elements were regarded as important, and that would obviously be a key part of the discussion of the legislation. Next point, please. To build where possible on existing initiatives and due diligence frameworks. Sophia said at the beginning that a number of companies, the DigiJustice study revealed that about 1/3 of companies already have some kind of due diligence framework in place. Obviously, we want to build on those. We don't want them to have to reinvent the wheel. So that's where possible should build on existing initiatives. Next slide, please. We thought it's important that there should be a due diligence obligation on all companies that source, trade and process forest risk commodities. So we're not aiming to distinguish between different levels of companies on the basis of their size or the position in the supply chain. Due diligence obligation should go throughout the supply chain. Next point, please. Now, due diligence, and this is how the concept is phrased, I think, in the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidance. The process of due diligence is to drive a process of continual improvement, encouraging the development and evolution of plans to address the risks. And if we get to the next point, please, I think this is an important point, and perhaps we might want to come back to this in the discussion. I think the due diligence approach it recognizes that not all challenges can be overcome immediately, straight away. You start with addressing the risks, the highest profile risks, then you gradually move on and you address them. And you see a process of improvement steadily. And it's important that the legislation requires that gradual process of improvement. But I think it is recognized that not all challenges can be overcome immediately. And given that, products from supply chains that don't meet all the criteria immediately should not be banned from the European market. And that's a difference from what's in Dalara's report, which I think has many interesting elements. Now, I think you can construct an argument for a prohibition, a ban, but I think it is a different concept from due diligence. And perhaps the two can work together. Perhaps there's a question of when the prohibition comes in and you do the kind of more gradual due diligence approach first. But I think that's a really important element of a due diligence approach. Next point, please. We also hope that the legislation will encourage the use of new technologies and new data sharing mechanisms. And actually, you've seen that with the EU timber regulation. You've seen an increase in the use of isotopic testing and DNA testing to try and derive where the timber is coming from and whether it's matching up with what the supplier is saying. So that's a really interesting development and really positive one, I think. Okay, next point, please. Now, it's acknowledged that there are, of course, dangers in the due diligence approach. There could be unintended consequences. Companies might choose to meet their due diligence obligations by simply abandoning high-risk suppliers, or possibly switching to different commodities that are low risk entirely. Perhaps switching out of palm oil towards rapeseed oil, for example. But all these commodities have environmental and social impacts. And if we get the next point, the basis again of the due diligence approach, it's that it's a gradual evolutionary approach. It ought to reward continued engagement with suppliers and working with them to eliminate the risks of whatever you're trying to eliminate. It shouldn't reward simply abandoning suppliers. And I think our concern was if you move straight to a prohibition, a ban on particular products, companies would meet that by simply dropping their high-risk suppliers. And we don't want that to happen. Due diligence should act as an enabler of good practice. Okay, if we move on to the next slide. So just picking up on those aims in a little bit more detail. So we have the next point, and many of these picking up on what previous speakers have said, actually, we think it's really important. This is particularly important for companies who don't want to deal with a patchwork of 27 different pieces of legislation, national legislation. There must be consistency in criteria and application across the EU to provide a level playing field. So it's a bit of a concern if the legislation is going to be a directive, which leaves obviously more flexibility for member states to apply it. Next point, please. I think this is now quite broadly accepted. The idea of a broad horizontal corporate due diligence obligation applying to companies not commodity specific throughout their operations supply chains is very welcome. But also, next point, and again, this has been recognized now, I think we also need detailed legislation for specified commodities or supply chains. That the sort of general corporate due diligence obligation isn't enough by itself. And inevitably, we were focusing on forest risk commodities, so we think that is the first thing to talk about. And you used to hear people talking about, well, we have the corporate due diligence obligation, and we have non-legally binding guidelines to accompany that. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the legislative instrument or instruments dealing with particular supply chains. Again, we didn't reach firm conclusions on what the criteria are for due diligence, but I think people were there's a pretty broad consensus that we're not just talking about illegality like the timber regulation. We're talking about human rights, we're talking about environmental impacts. And where possible, obviously there's a big debate to be had there about the definitions, but there are existing initiatives and frameworks like the Accountability Framework Initiative that should be drawn on, and of course the UN and OECD guidelines. I said this before, but the due diligence obligation, we believe, should be shared across all actors. So there's no company size threshold. There should be some obligation throughout the supply chain. But clearly it should be proportionate to a company's influence over the supply chain. Those companies who are sourcing the commodities in the first place from the countries of origin obviously have more influence. So we didn't really reach a firm conclusion on how that could be varied, but that's an issue for discussion. Next point, please. Now, the requirements for companies have to be clear. They have to be absolutely clear what they're doing. And you can conceive of 3 different ways in which the requirements can be applied. First of all, the requirement to exercise due diligence. Secondly, the requirement that you see in the timber regulation to have in place a system of due diligence. And in practice, in the timber regulation, that's where most of the compliance operation has been focused. You make sure that companies have a system of due diligence and that it's an adequate system of due diligence, not just a tick box exercise. And then a third requirement for compliance could be to issue regular reports or on what the company is doing or plans for what they plan to do. And you could use all of these three requirements. And again, that's part of the discussion. Next point, please. But given that, and given the complexity of monitoring whether companies have due diligence systems in place and whether they are adequate due diligence systems, and that's an important point, we think enforcement is primarily a role for the state. You can't just leave it to the courts to judge. And compliance competent authorities and states must be properly resourced and have recourse to adequate penalties. And that's a bit of a problem in the timber regulation in some countries. But we also think there should be the possibility of third-party legal action in cases of companies' failure to exercise due diligence. So a forest community, a civil society, whatever, could take action in the courts if the whole compliance system fails. That's your kind of backstop. And last point on this, again, the due diligence approach encompasses the idea of complaints and remediation mechanisms. That's important. We didn't have much time to discuss how that could work in detail, but companies did identify the problem in every single company setting up its own complaint system. Might be better to have, there might be a role for the state there and having a kind of an overall complaint system based in the countries of origin where people can find it easy to access. And then obviously there needs to be some kind of remediation mechanism. Okay, so that's our summaries pretty much on due diligence, but I just wanted to make the point that Felipe mentioned, I think it's come up a little bit in discussion, that we have the next point here. There are limits to what industry can achieve by itself. Industry can do a lot of things to control what's in their supply chains, but they can't, for example, incentivize or require host country governments to improve their standards of governance or law enforcement or provide better support for farmers or things like that. So really due diligence will work much better if it's part of a smart mix or a package of measures. And I'll just run through this briefly because we're up against time, but we think the kind of measures we're talking about in the smart mix are critically action on the ground in producer countries. Ideally, partnership agreements like the voluntary partnership agreements we see for timber. We think that's a good model. It's referred to in Delara's report, I noticed in passing, which is a good thing, positive thing. And I think people seem to agree that the VPA model could probably work for cocoa, rather more difficult to see how it could work for other commodities in other countries. And of course, the timber regulation and the timber VPAs work together, and due diligence, because the timber regulation gives a green light to timber licensed under the partnership agreement, it acts as an incentive for countries to agree partnership agreements. So that's a good kind of mutually reinforcing couple of measures. For countries where the VPA style agreement isn't applicable or isn't possible, we need to look at other types of agreements, free trade agreements, investment agreements, and I think there's quite a lot of interesting thinking going on there. Bernd mentioned that at the beginning about the role of EU free trade agreements. And of course, the whole scope of development assistance to support producer countries in building the kind of frameworks they need to be consistent with this due diligence obligation. Second component in the smart mix of measures, obviously action in the EU, this is due diligence legislation, but there might be other things as well. The possibility of reform of competition law to make it easier for companies to collaborate in a non-competitive way on issues of global public good like sustainability. Possibility of public procurement policy to boost the market for sustainable or deforestation-free commodities, and of course dialogue with other consumer countries. The EU is not the major consumer for most of these commodities. China is usually the one, so really important that dialogue is meaningful, perhaps supporting policy development. Next point, please. Obviously, regulation of finance and investment is key as well. We need to steer finance and investment towards sustainable activities and away from unsustainable. We think the due diligence model could work there if you put a due diligence obligation on financial institutions to avoid investments in unsustainable activities. But also there needs to be more support like blended finance to promote investments. And then final point, systems of verification and certification are important. They play a role in all of these measures potentially, and it's important that they're supported and made to work together with these measures rather than against them. That's all from me. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks a lot, Philippe and Duncan. It was a really ambitious catalogue of needs from Duncan. end of his presentation. Now I have 3 questions, and first is to Felipe. Are there traders in the FTA, and which one are there?
Yes, there's a wide array of private companies linked to TFA as a big community. For example, in the trading side of things, you have companies such as Cargill and LDC, Louis Dreyfus Company, plus retailers such as Ahold, the Highs, and many others involved in the business perspective. But aside from that, aside from the direct membership to TFA, TFA is also working very closely with the Consumers Goods Forum, and that covers a wider range of companies, of course, in different front of action. And we're trying to work on the forest coalition from the CGF to engage more of these companies into the commitments and action-driven support.
Thanks a lot. And Duncan, you mentioned the encouragement to develop and the evaluation of plans. What does it mean in practical terms?
Yeah, that's a good question. And one of the key questions we should be talking about. And this is the due, I tried to stress this, this is the due diligence approach as it's expressed in the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidance and so on, that it doesn't assume you can solve all problems straight away. It means you have to apply, as Delara expressed, the due diligence approach. You have to analyze your supply chains. You have to assess the level of risk. You have to come up with a plan to deal with that. And then you have to put it into action. And then you have to report on all of it. And you assume that that builds up year by year. It gets better. It doesn't just, you don't just have a plan and then do nothing about it. So I think that means you have to have a role for quite an active state compliance mechanism. You have to have an authority that gets to be familiar with the supply chains and understands what companies are doing and what they're capable of. And where there are existing initiatives, perhaps like the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, or RSPO level standards for, or NDPE standards for sourcing palm oil, you have to be clear that companies are moving towards those, and then beyond those towards further action. They don't just reach a certain level of due diligence and then stop. So it's impossible to say precisely what that means because it will vary with commodity and country. But you need to have, I think, a compliance mechanism that measures the degree to which companies are doing that and puts it into and makes sure they are doing it and not just getting away with doing the minimum necessary.
And Duncan, what about the reference to the report on the cutting off date for products? I think in the report of we have the 1st of January 2008. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so that is, I mean, that is part of the prohibition. Then the report says, and it's the first element of it, is that companies must make sure that there's only a negligible risk of putting products on the European market that are associated with deforestation, forest degradation, and human rights abuses. And it defines deforestation as mean no deforestation of primary forest after 2008. So I mean, clearly, it's a clear definition. As I said in the presentation, I think we have a problem, or perhaps I'm speaking personally now. I think there is an issue with the prohibition element, and I don't think it's part of a due diligence approach, because it basically means straight away you must make sure that the products you're putting in the market aren't associated with these things. It's not the due diligence approach of gradual understanding of the risks and gradual evolution of measures to deal with it. And I think in practice, it would be really difficult to do. And if you look at child labor and cocoa, for example, it's almost impossible to eliminate child labor from the cocoa supply chain completely. You can make progress in reducing it. But I think if you put a prohibition on any cocoa sourced with any level of child labor on the European market, I think there just wouldn't be any, or at least not from West Africa, to put it on this. So I think you can produce an argument for a prohibition, a ban. I don't think it's part of a due diligence approach. I think it's a separate element. And perhaps it's something that you might bring in at some point in the future when you've made real good progress on your due diligence approach and you're close to being able to do that. But I think it goes against the due diligence approach if you bring it in straight away.
And you mentioned some big companies, for example, the Cocoa Initiative, dealing with the sustainability in the production chain. What about the small and medium-sized enterprises? Do you have also some of them in your context, and how are they able to fulfill the obligations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think most of our participants in our roundtables have been from larger companies. Inevitably, they're the kind of people who have enough staff to be able to spend the time to engage with this. Though we have had national industry initiatives, palm oil and soy initiatives, which represent a lot of companies dealing with palm oil and soy across the country they're talking about. So we have had some input there. I think we were clear that the due diligence obligation has to apply throughout the supply chain. We shouldn't be not including SMEs just because they're small. But I think this is another area where I think we could do with further discussion. I mean, clearly SMEs, they have simpler supply chains. They're probably not sourcing directly from the country of origin. They might be in some cases, but not always. Given having a smaller range of suppliers, they ought to find the due diligence obligation easier to cope with. There is possible benefit in what I understand by the Dutch child labour due diligence legislation approach, which is that companies either have to exercise due diligence with regard to child labour in the supply chains, or they have to get a declaration from the company they're sourcing from that that company has itself exercised due diligence. And as long as you can be sure that that declaration is robust and really it's genuine, then that might be a way of tackling it, because it means you don't have to require SMEs several links down the supply chain to have do a sort of lot of work in tracking all the different links in the supply chain. You focus the action on the companies who are sourcing from the country of origin directly. But we haven't answered every question. I think these are all the questions that are going to be important to look at in the process of the legislation. And what we try to do is identify the key issues and provide answers where we can.
Yes, thanks a lot for that. And specifically, the question of SMEs was also really crucial in the discussion on the conflict minerals. So we have indeed some really small demander for gold, for example, and how to guarantee that they are able to fulfill the obligations. So we created a handbook, some guidance, some specific requirements on the OECD guidelines. So it's a huge amount of work we have to do. Thanks a lot to Philippe and Duncan. Now we switch to the third part of the game, and I will give back the floor to Heidi.
Yeah, thanks, Bernd. I think we had some really crucial questions in the session that you moderated. And I think what Duncan has said about the due diligence approach, prohibitions versus evolution and continuous improvement, is something that we have to think about. And I could believe that our next speaker might maybe be able to enlighten us on that a bit. She's Shivani Kanaviran, and she's going to explain to us how current and planned updates to agricultural supply chain guidelines contribute to the development of EU due diligence regulations. So it's great to have OECD here. And I must say that we have enjoyed the expertise of Christina Tebales as one of the advisors to our Responsible Business Conduct Working Group. So it's also a continuous interaction between the MEPs and yourself. So Shivani, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can folks hear me clearly? Great. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to the working group on RBC of the European Parliament, and to Fern for this opportunity. It's been remarkable actually to hear all these discussions and the lead up to here. So I'm really excited. I'm only going to take a little bit of your time this morning, and I wanted to talk about three things. First of all, I thought it would be useful to share a little bit our experience on the OECD side, working actually with companies to implement this due diligence approach. And I think that's super important because, I've been working on this now since 2011, 2012, and prior to that with companies more broadly. And we are at a stage, and I've seen some of the comments that, we need to see action. We need to see implementation, and we need to see implementation at scale. And these are really different dynamics. So it's not enough to just go in a drip fashion with progressive companies. We need scale. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I do want to talk as well and address some of the actions the OECD is doing in terms of strengthening the environmental aspect of our due diligence approach. And just broadly, just so that everybody knows, for us at the OECD, when we talk about due diligence, it's very comprehensive in terms of the risks that we cover. So it's environmental risks, yes, but also human rights risks, governance risks, corruption, etc. So it's very, very broad. And finally, I'll just share some thoughts, just a second, just some thoughts on the current legislation discussion. Just some, I think some lessons learned, some observations, and I think many of those have already been reflected. So happy to share that with you, please. Next slide, thank you. So the OECD work on responsible business conduct is quite broad, but we've also got guidance on responsible agricultural supply chains. And I'm going to focus a little bit on that. But the red thread, I would say, across all our instruments and guidance is this concept or approach of risk-based due diligence. That's really the framework that we're talking about. It's a comprehensive coverage of risks, and it's across the entire value chain. So when I say value chain, by that I mean it actually is recommendations that apply to input suppliers all the way up to retailers, but also investors. And I think that's a grouping that we really need to not forget, because they really have a massive power in the market to effect change. We also, in our work on risk-based due diligence, it's really drawn from work that we've done in minerals. So our conflict minerals work that was mentioned by Bernd actually a little earlier, our work in agriculture, also our work in the garment and footwear sector, and our work with the financial sector. So we're really drawing on the overall experience to date in implementing and developing these due diligence guidelines. One interesting comment that came up a little earlier was, what about SMEs, and our approach really is flexible enough. So we do include SMEs into this. This is not only targeted to the large companies. And for a host of reasons, we believe that in order to see this sort of change, you need to have all companies involved. And with SMEs, I do think it's fair to say that the supply chain may be less complex for SMEs. But here's where we also encourage cooperation with either industry groups or across the sector that SMEs should be part of. But again, I'll talk about that towards the end, and when I touch on this idea of this smart mix of what we need to see. In terms of the environmental risks within the due diligence guidance, we really draw attention to the environment side, and it's not just deforestation, but it includes deforestation. In the OECD FAO guidance, in the section on environmental protection and the sustainable use of natural resources, but also in the section on access to tenure. I think one of the important things that we have, and this is an important part of our approach and framework, is that we really help companies think through prioritization and characterization of risks. And one of the concepts that we advocate is actually looking at enhanced due diligence when there's a high risk. And a high risk can happen in terms of where you're sourcing from, so the geographic risks. It can also be part of the product itself, and it can also be part of your business relationship. And these are some of the thinking that we've integrated into our due diligence approach, which for most businesses is not, it's not new. And this I think is actually very helpful, because businesses actually, we need to speak to businesses in language that they can understand. We also do encourage companies to use existing tools that they have, such as the EIAs, the ESHRIAs, different tools that they already have at their disposal. But I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things we're seeing. If you could go to the next slide. So we conducted, no, actually the slide before. Yes, so what are we seeing? I'm going to just draw from some of the findings that we had in a pilot that the OECD and FAO led in 2019 with a group of companies. Here we did it was essentially a year project, about 10 to 12 months, where we worked with a real diversity of companies in the agri-food and non-food supply chain. Actually, the value chain. We had investors involved. We had about 30 companies, and also industry groups. So, groups like Responsible Palm Oil, also the soy, Responsible Soy grouping, where we really wanted to look across the value chain. How are companies taking these commitments, these frameworks, and how are they actually applying it? What steps are they taking to actually follow these recommendations in their own operations and then throughout the supply chain? And, many companies, of course, have a clear understanding and control over their own operations. And I would say up to their, first supply chain or direct contracts. The difficulty is when you go beyond and you try to go to the rest of the supply chain. And that continues to be really a work in progress. And what we're seeing, even amongst these companies in the pilot, and they were by and large, I would say, the companies that we know about, the very progressive companies that are really, we see them in almost every initiative. You see the common names, right? And they're all very, so they've got very sophisticated processes in place. And overall, many of them have taken steps to strengthen their approach in due diligence. Even in the short 10-month framework, we saw that, those that had continued to strengthen their approach in due diligence on the environmental side, we're looking at deforestation, we're looking at water contamination, water depletion issues as well. So they've got these sophisticated approaches. The difficulty or the biggest challenge comes in actually putting these policy commitments, I would say, into actual implementation actions. So this is where we are seeing that there's still a pretty broad gap into how companies are actually translating it into actions. We also found, and that's the second last bullet, that understandably for many companies out there, there's a heavy reliance on schemes, industry schemes, third parties, certifications, in order to demonstrate that they're doing due diligence or that they're part of responsible supply chains. And while we don't say that they should not use that, we say, look, that's well and good. We do think that it's important that in order to depend on these sort of schemes, they should be aligned with international standards and with international frameworks. And there is where we've done some excellent, I'd say really groundbreaking work in the minerals sector, as well as today we're continuing to do some of that in the garment and footwear sector. And that's the alignment assessment work that the OECD has been leading. And I think that's the sort of work that we want to see as well integrated into any legislative approaches, to bear in mind that part of what needs to happen is that we need to look at the tools that are out there in the market and ensure that they are also harmonized with our due diligence approaches. And then finally, it's very interesting to see in Delara's report as well, this duty of transparency, because we do need to see that we did see, for example, that there's still a lack of information about the due diligence risks and practices in public reporting. And bear in mind, all the OECD instruments and standards, they are voluntary, right? So, we would like to see actually a higher uptake of these approaches. Part of the pilot also, we used it to also to share and talk about some of the tools that companies are using in terms of identifying risk, particularly on deforestation risk. And it was interesting to hear about the call from, I think, FHK and from TFA to use technology. And we are seeing technology is today actually able to provide us with some pretty important examples or tools in order to sort of keep track of, for example, in deforestation, we had information on satellite mapping, GIS data. But interestingly, the more progressive companies are also linking this sort of technological work with on-the-ground engagement with CSOs that are on the ground that can actually send monthly alerts to their supply chain. So you need a mix of also future technology, but in some ways it's still the old-fashioned, consulting and working together with people, particularly on the ground. And I think that was another point that Dilara mentioned in her report on the duty to consult. I think the final point I'd say from the pilot that I haven't put up here, but it's that, we had investors as well as part of this pilot. And while many investors, of course, are using ESG approaches in order to push forward and to ask the right questions, there's still quite a level of inconsistency into what questions they're asking, what metrics they're using, and this is a challenge for companies. So I think as we move forward, we need to also drill down on how that could be perhaps more streamlined, what makes sense, what's comparable, and that requires, I would say, further dialogue, particularly with the investor community and also civil society. If you could go to the next slide. And I just want to say that for all of these standards that I'm mentioning, at the last slide, I have a list of links and things like that. So please, this will all be shared with you so that you can access this directly. Some of the actions that we are taking on to promote due diligence to address, particularly on the environmental issues, but also just more broadly on the due diligence issues. Look, we are working very closely with providing advice to regulators at the EU level for sure. We are in conversations with multiple DGs to really incorporate the OECD due diligence approach and framework into policy and legislation. Again, our frameworks are frameworks. They're not, you can't just copy paste it and put it into legislation, but there's certainly many elements that should be and can be incorporated. The alignment assessment, so these are the alignment of these market tools or certification systems. This is, I think, a significant area of work and good work, and it really helps then bring implementation at scale and use market mechanisms. I think there's also a role for us to actually work to understand within different commodities and supply chains, what are the control points? And that's a rather technical due diligence concept that we have really built up, which is, supply chains primarily have a very broad base at the bottom, and then they sort of narrow or taper to the middle part, and then they broaden out again. And it's that middle part where we believe we can actually focus on so that you don't duplicate the issue of audits. So for example, in the mineral supply chain, we really have defined that to be the refiners and smelters. Likewise, in, for example, the cocoa supply chain, one could make the argument that it's actually at the exporter level, or the cocoa, the board level. So this is important for us to actually engage with those actors and to ask them, what due diligence steps are you doing to ensure that the risks that we're looking at that are happening primarily, not exclusively, but primarily at what I call the upstream level is understood. And finally, we are actually writing a white paper, which will be published at the end of this year, on the environmental considerations of due diligence. In the first instance, it's really more of an awareness raising exercise targeted to both our delegates, our adherents, but also the wider stakeholder community. And just to say that there are existing both OECD tools out there and also additional tools out there. One of the things we'd like to do is actually to go deeper a little bit and take stock of the practical tools that businesses can use to actually address some of these environmental risks. And we think that will be actually quite helpful. We're also working quite closely with UNEP and UNFCCC, and I think this is important because certainly at the international level, we're seeing there's a lot more collaboration happening both at the OECD EU level, but also across the IOs. Final things to consideration, if you could go to the last slide. Just a couple of high-level thoughts. Legislation can certainly be a catalyst for change and awareness. When I started working on this area, it was the Dodd-Frank Act on conflict minerals in the US that really was pushing discussions on this and folks really thinking about this. And guidelines and voluntary work tends to attract the progressives, the progressive companies, the progressive thinkers on it. But if you want to see scale, certainly legislation is the catalyst. However, we do need to be aware of potential unintended consequences, and we saw that as well in the Dodd-Frank aspect, where because it was linked so closely to a specific geographic region, the market reacted in a way that said, okay, we will not source from that market, which didn't solve your problem and had other unintended consequences because the companies didn't invest in these countries that needed that investment. So we just need to make sure that it's done in a thoughtful way. And this brings me to my second point, which is we really would advocate I know this word sometimes gets people's hackles up, this smart mix, but I'm taking it really as it says, really we do need to be thoughtful about what's the right mix of legislation, but also voluntary or development or supportive measures. And I think in that we need to really think carefully about ways to use market tools, market mechanisms to align to international standards, because if not, we'll be having this discussion in another 20 years. And I don't think any one of us wants to be at that stage again in 20 years. And here I would really say and I think DG Trade is one group that on the EU level that we've worked with quite a bit, and the legislation on conflict minerals, the whole integrated approach, I think there's a lot to be said there. And I would hope that we can actually learn from how some of these are working in practice. The third point is super important. I think it's on us to really minimize confusion in the market. And sometimes confusion is an excuse. I've heard companies say, oh, it's just so confusing. But I do take that as well as real feedback. And one way in which we can reduce the confusion is to actually refer to these international standards, particularly on due diligence. And I see we've done that in the draft report that Delara has issued. It's the OECD FAO guidance is certainly highlighted. I would say that to also look at the OECD, the more recent due diligence guidance for RBC, which is the latest and greatest, if you will. It's not specific to ag, it's more agnostic on the sector, but it has some very, very good points in clarification on key concepts of due diligence. I do think, and this, I think, Heidi, you had also mentioned this, the different, and we've seen it already, and there's a lot, it's great to see the discussions and the collaboration happening between DG DEFCO, DG Agri, DG Trade, DG Environment, DG Justice. But I do think as part of this, there has to be some efforts to also really explain how the laws, the directives work together, because there are quite a few. There's the EU non-financial reporting directive, for example. So how do these all map and link together? I think it's important. And one last final point, I know, Delara, that you'd included remediation under the civil aspect, but for us at the OECD, remediation, and then you'll see actually in our latest guidance from 2018, we really talk about it as part and parcel of the due diligence process. So maybe it might be useful to consider putting that in that section. But I know it's you will have this report open for consultation and comments, and we will certainly be providing that in writing. But also we're also always very happy to continue these discussions, and if we can provide more clarity, I think we can take all of that offline, but very open to doing that. The final slide as the next slide, please, Daria. Yeah, so here are the different links. My email is at the bottom. So if there are others in the audience, if there were issues that you had or you'd like to continue the discussion, please, please feel free to get in touch. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Shivani. I think when you mentioned that it should be explained how the various EU instruments already there and in the planning will sort of act together, I come to think of the proposal that several member states have made, and I'm assured that the European Parliament has said this several times, that the EU needs to draw an action plan on business and human rights. It's been very diligent in watching the member states to do so, but it hasn't won itself. And I think we've been waiting for at least 5 years, if not more, if not since 2011, that something would happen. And now I saw this demand explicitly in the French Dutch proposal. for sort of integrating due diligence with trade and whatnot. And I think the representatives of the German government also mentioned this lately in one discussion. So I think it's something that could, of course, create the kind of the big picture, the frame, but it should not delay the work on the legislation, I believe. So now, since there is no clarification question, I am happy to open the session for debate. And I have a list of questions that have been put forward. Just a second. Yeah, so I will ask the person who has presented the question if they want to do it themselves. They're most welcome to do that. So the first would be Bukye Tailwes. Bukye. We are very active in the chat, but I don't see Bukye, so I will read the question.
I think I'm here now. Somebody unmuted.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it took a second for the system to restart. But thank you very much. This was very interesting. I have one question, which is actually also a concern that I have, a big concern. And that concern is related to the impact on the ground for producers. The concern is related to what was mentioned by Duncan, also Shivani and others, potential disengagement of companies, disengagement from certain high risk or perceived high risk actors like smallholder farmers, or even entire regions like we saw with conflict minerals in Central Africa. Duncan, you mentioned that it is very important to incentivize engagement with these high risk actors or regions, and also stress the point that the OECD due diligence guidance and UN guiding principles actually promote or very much emphasize the engagement. My question is, are there ideas on how to do this? How companies could be engaged to take that more difficult route, actually? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bukye. We would like you to present yourself. Could you do that?
Oh, apologies. Yes. So my name is Bukye Tailwes. I work for Solidaridad. We're a global network NGO. We work on different commodities, including minerals, gold, but also cocoa, palm oil, soy, coffee, etc.
Thanks. So there will be more questions, and I would maybe like the one who presents the question to identify the person who should answer. So the next would be Charlotte Opal, and please always present yourselves. Charlotte, are you there? Charlotte Opal.
Hi,
Okay.
yes. Hi, this is Charlotte Opal. I'm from the Forest Conservation Fund. We help companies actively protect forests and their supply chains, which are at risk of deforestation for the commodities they're purchasing in the landscape. I wanted to know what the EU is doing to reduce overall demand for imported deforestation, and specifically, since our biggest footprint from deforestation is from meat and animal feed production, is the EU promoting a reduction in meat consumption? Thank you.
Thank you. Then we have Rob Delette. Rob, are you there? Rob Delette. I'm ready to present your question. Are you there?
Is there but muted?
Rob, you must unmute yourself.
Yes, hello. The system was a little slow to react. Hello, everybody. Thank you for doing all this. My name is Rob de Laat. I'm currently in Amsterdam, but I'm usually based in Brazil, where I have my own reforestation project. And beside that, I'm a full-time volunteer in all kinds of actions regarding the planet. my question is, I think it's wonderful what you're doing. And at the same time, I want to say that, as we all know, there is an urgency in the Amazon, and we all know we're approaching the tipping point where the forest will die back by itself. And so, and we also know that there is irresponsible action taking place at a large scale in Brazil. So while the due diligence process has to come online in the next few years, we don't have time for that. Is it possible in the EU to have emergency measures with regards to meat, soy, etc., with regards to the actions in Brazil to put pressure on stopping the destruction? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. I also have Petri Lehtonen here. Petri, are you there? Petri, you have to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I can put them. Yeah. Okay, so myself, I'm working for the Forest for the Future facility. I mean, we are advising the DevCo in future forest interventions and kind of independent facility. And thank you very much. This has been extremely interesting. My question is actually somehow partly presented already earlier, and it was also reflected in Duncan Brack's presentation. My concern is really also these smallholder producers, like when we have more regulations on due diligence, I mean, how they can have the capacity to comply with those, because there might be this thing that, okay, then only the best ones will survive, and we will remain with these, let's say, social issues, all the social development, which is very much depending on the smallholder production and small and medium-sized enterprises. And if it just have more and more regulations and difficulties for these operators, it's probably quite a challenge, I would say. So I think that at the same time, I think that it's excellent to have this kind of mandatory due diligence and process, but then actually there has to be kind of actions to make sure that we will have also space for the smallholders and small and medium-sized enterprises to develop, and that's actually, I think that's already presented. Thank you very much.
Heidi, you're muted.
Yes, thank you for the questions. Now, I assume that our panelists would want to try to give answers to them. So basically, this is to all the panelists. So who would want to answer the question on the negative impact on the ground, how to avoid and how to incentivize continued engagement and improvement with high risk? That was to Duncan. And Duncan, you mentioned it yourself. So this was clearly quite interesting what you said. So you can elaborate a bit more.
Yeah, so it is absolutely a key question. So I think it leads us to three conclusions. One is that it kind of reinforces the need for action on the ground in producer countries as part of the smart mix. That's why we talk about smart mixes. You know, due diligence will not solve these problems by itself. I think it's an important issue, a really important part of the solution, and it shouldn't need to wait for all the others, because there will be delays before we put all the other measures in place. But it does reinforce the need for action on the ground. And I think the ideal solution is a partnership type agreement like a VPA, which tries to address the root causes of deforestation, child labour, human rights abuses, and so on, which are often weaknesses in governance and law enforcement. If that partnership agreement model is not possible, or it takes too long to put in place, then I think we should look at using development assistance targeted particularly on sustainable agriculture and addressing these problems. And I think the third conclusion it leads us to is that I think it's a real problem to put the kind of prohibition, ban on products that are not produced to particular criteria on the European market straight away, because it will hit products produced by high-risk suppliers. And I think it means, companies will have no option but to drop them. So I think it might be a long-term solution. I don't think it's an immediate solution.
Thanks very much, Duncan. Then we have the question about what the EU is doing to reduce overall consumption of meat, which has the biggest deforestation footprint. Well, let me try to say that maybe the farm to fork strategy would offer a chance to raise this question, but so far it's a big taboo. It's very difficult to agree on anything. And so if there are some good suggestions on how to do this, then who would want to take this question? Anyone? So what the EU is doing, is that the EU doing anything? Sophie, I see you're trying to take the floor, please.
No, just to basically echo what you said. I'm not an expert in this, but I know that there was plenty of discussion about this in the farm to fork strategy. So this is an area that the farm to fork strategy wants to look into. So I don't know whether colleagues working on this have already ideas or anything has been announced, but this is definitely part of the debate. Thank you.
I could just add, Heidi, not from my work with EFICA and TFA, but as part of the team that produced a feasibility study for the Commission a couple of years ago, which listed different options for addressing deforestation. And we identified current health campaigns to persuade people to eat more healthfully, which often focus on red meat and processed meat and sugar, and all those commodities are associated with deforestation. If there's some way of building into those health campaigns, and they are having an effect, certainly in some countries, the kind of deforestation and environmental impact message, that is an option worth pursuing. I think the EU could do more, but you can understand why this is a really complex, difficult question. It addresses farmers' livelihoods within the EU. It's an important lobby, and politicians tend to be wary of telling people what to eat or what not to eat. So it is a tricky one to get into.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe in the farm to fork strategy, we'll try to pick up this issue, but we have to be prepared that from the agriculture lobby, there will be huge resistance, and there will also be some attempts to ban the words like veggie burgers, because they don't want any threats to meat consumption. Right. So then who would want to answer the question of Rob Delet on emergency measures vis-a-vis deforestation through imported deforestation, soy, corn, beef, wood, finance, and infrastructure. Can I just intervene here and say that I've seen two very bold statements by commercial actors who have told the Brazilian government lately that they're not going to do business with them if they continue destroying the Amazon. One was from, I think, a large number of European, mainly retailers, and the other one was from investors. So I think we can hope that the companies can take a more prominent role in these discussions with the governments that are not really responding to the EU tendencies. For instance, this goes back to the Mercosur agreement. Does anyone want to take this question? Shivani? No? You look like you would want to. No,
no, I was just moving
Felipe,
in my seat.
Felipe from Rainforest Alliance.
Yes, thank you. Just briefly, Heidi. Yes, I think it's a good question. We have to be aware of the concept of leakage, right? Like, how do we go in an appropriate balanced way so that we put pressure, and hopefully we engage companies to put pressure into these producer countries to move forward, to get engaged into the sustainable production, but in a way that we do not create a condition of leakage, which just basically backfires, and the emerging markets start to capture all of that. So you end up in that position that was mentioned, that, you know, products go into Europe, but the impact's still there, right? And I would just mention that the green financial sector should be engaged, because we can work not only on the finance of the you know, asset managers investing on companies, but also in terms of the flow of resources for the Brazilian economy, the rating of the economy in such a way that the cash flow helps us mobilize the wheel towards that direction. I'll leave it there, but I think it's a complex and a very good question, because the balance has to occur so that we can get the traction on the ground.
Heidi, if I may just jump in.
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
You know, and also to Bauke's earlier question, you know, one of the things that we've seen, and Bauke, just so for clarity, Bauke and I have actually worked in the past together on the conflict minerals work, and she didn't mention, but she used to work with Philips for many years. So it's really good to have people who have been in different worlds to see how things can actually work in practice. And you know, I do think it's really important to use all the different and all the different actors, particularly the governments, need to be much more engaged in real partnership with producing country governments. And I think that's an important concept that we need to build in. There's the legislation, but we do need to think about how can we actually work closely with governments on the ground. And that's some of the things. So for example, at the OECD, although it's OECD, our work is not exclusively with OECD countries. So for example, the due diligence guidances are adhered to by additional countries who are not OECD members. And we actually have engagement and implementation work ongoing, for example, right now, with a range of countries in Asia, including China, including Southeast Asian countries who are not members of the OECD, but who are part of these global supply chains, right? And we work both with the governments as well as the businesses. So it's a two-pronged approach, which you really do need. And this is, well, you know, the market carrot, if you will, is a very strong, it's really a very strong mover, you know. The EU is a big market. And if you bring into that as well, beyond EU, other OECD countries, you really have quite a bit of leverage in that sense. So I would really stress that we do need to be, and use the word partnership credibly and honestly, a real partnership. So not something that's imposed later on. I think that's a very important point. And we've seen, for example, in the work that we did in Central Africa, where we worked very, very closely with the governments from the ICGLR, which is the international group of the Great Lakes region. So you've got 12 countries from the Central African region involved with our work. So it's very important to do that, and to be humble that this is a global issue. So we all need to come together to make it work. I'll leave that at that. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That's very insightful. We had the question from Petri Lehtonen about how small and medium-sized enterprises could cope with the new future demands on due diligence and the rest. I think some of you referred to this issue, and I think we have to keep in mind that there seems to be a growing consensus that we shouldn't have anything like the French law on due diligence has a kind of a very, let's say, high threshold of companies being in the scope of the legislation. 5,000 workers, I think it's 10,000 worldwide. So does anyone want to clarify the issue of SMEs here?
Very shortly, 1 minute.
If I may.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's actually a crucial question. It's extremely important. And it's interesting that you just mentioned the example of the French law. I believe that that's a very important element to bear in mind in terms of thresholds. We seem to be there quite on the same page. But an issue to bear in mind here is actually that whatever new regulations or laws or also non-regulatory approaches are defined and then implemented, we need to bear in mind the small holders or the SMEs, both within the EU and in the producing countries. And the approach there is it can be very different. It can have similarities, but it can be very different. And in our experience, for example, with EU timber regulation, as it has been mentioned before during today's very interesting event, yes, it's quite clear that for SMEs this is not easy, and I wouldn't quite agree that SMEs have simpler supply chains or it's simpler for them to do it. Not always, and you have very different SMEs in Eastern Bulgaria, Northern Finland, or in Paris. So the realities of SMEs within the EU are extremely different, and we need to bear all of those in mind because we work for the EU as a whole. And then in third countries, it's another issue which has to be central in our partnership approach towards the third countries. That is clear that we have to work with producing countries. But I find it extremely interesting that the colleague is actually, he said that he works for Forest for the Future facility for DevCo, and this is actually a question for DevCo. So maybe you could try to answer yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bojan. Now we are exactly on time, and it's my pleasure now to hand over to Indra and Bernd to take the final wrapping up of this interesting seminar. So I thank for my part, and maybe Bernd first, and then Indra. We have 5 minutes left, as we should.
Yes, thanks a lot, Heidi. And first of all, thanks to the working group and to the people organizing here this online seminar. It is really a great opportunity to reflect the necessary steps for the future. So thanks a lot. And the technical performance was also excellent. So thanks a lot. Yes, we got a heavy workload now. Huh? I think it's clear that we should work on a European approach for a binding due diligence legislation, but also, and we discussed some elements, and we are also clear that we need also cooperation with the partner countries. Even at the moment, it's not so easy with Brazil, I guess, but nevertheless, the regulatory framework in the partner countries is also important in the development. We saw that transparency is one of the major elements for future work. And a lot of other items are mentioned, even the question of SMEs in the last question. So the devil is in the detail. And we have to work out the details so that the legislation is really practical for companies and give a proper result. This means, of course, also that we need a proper enforcement procedure in the regulation. Heavy workload. Hopefully, we will get a legislation done in the next year. Let's work for that. And once again, thanks a lot. And Ine, it's your turn.
Thank you, Bernd, and many thanks to all the interveners and speakers that we hear today and could share also their insights and views. I really think it was an incredible, rich debate. We recorded many questions, and unfortunately we were unable to answer all the questions or give the floor to many of the participants. So definitely it's to be continued. I really would like to thank the Responsible Business Conduct Working Group for this initiative and especially Heidi and Bernd for the excellent facilitation. I also would like to thank the participants for attending with so many people, and I really hope that we will be in contact, we remain in contact. What we've heard today is very encouraging, that horizontal due diligence regulation could fit together with a vertical product-based one. And we really believe that we need also a smart mix of measures, including measures for producing countries, as well as also for trade of products coming into the EU. So we look forward to the